A 2-year-old boy walked into a cornfield in Lemhi County, Idaho, in the summer of 1971, and for 55 years, no one who loved him knew if he was alive. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday, a DNA testing kit bought as a joke cracked open a case the state police had never officially closed. What that kit found wasn't a body. It wasn't a grave. It was a 57-year-old man living 3 states away who had no idea his real name was Ethan Parker. This is the story of how he came home. The Salmon River Valley in Idaho does not look like a place where something can disappear. The land is too open for that, too honest. In 1971, it was cattle country and hayfields, a scatter of ranch houses along a 2-lane road, and a river that ran cold even in July because it was fed by snowmelt that never fully stopped. Wayne and Carol Parker had a small spread 11 miles outside of Salmon, a town so small that everyone in it could have fit inside a single church, and most Sundays, most of them did. Wayne worked cattle and split his summers doing fence repair for 3 of his neighbors. Carol kept a garden that fed both families some years. And she kept 2 children, Diane, who was 7 that summer, and Ethan, who had just turned 2 in May. Ethan had a way of humming to himself when he was content, a low, tuneless sound that Carol said she could pick out of a crowd. He liked the dog before he liked most people. He was, by every account gathered later, an easy, happy child, the kind of toddler who made people say things would be fine. The community around the Parkers ran on trust, the way small ranching towns often did in that era. Doors were left unlocked. Children wandered between properties. A neighbor woman might watch 3 families' kids on a given afternoon without anyone calling it a favor. Because it wasn't one. It was just how the valley worked. Carol Parker had grown up 40 minutes from where she now lived. Wayne's family had been running cattle in the same 12 miles of river bottom since before the war. Nobody in that country locked a door, and nobody thought twice about a toddler playing where an adult could see him from a kitchen window. That summer smelled like most Idaho summers did in the valley. Cut hay drying in the sun, diesel from the tractor Wayne kept running most afternoons. The faint mineral cold that came off the river even when the air above it hit 90 degrees. Radios in that country still pulled in 1M station out of Boise more clearly than anything local, and Carol would leave it playing low through the kitchen window while she worked, country music and grain prices, and twice an hour, the time and temperature. Diane remembers the corn that year as taller than usual, thick enough by mid-July that a child could vanish 3 rows in and be swallowed from view entirely, a detail that felt unremarkable at the time and unbearable in hindsight. Ethan had a set of hand-me-down cowboy boots 2 sizes too big that he refused to take off even in the heat, and Carol used to be able to track roughly where he was in the yard by the sound of them scuffing along the porch boards. She would say, decades later, that the worst part of that particular afternoon was not any single sound. It was the boots going quiet, and her not noticing right away that they had. Everyone in that stretch of the valley knew everyone else's children on sight, knew whose dog belonged to whose porch, knew which pickup truck belonged to which rancher from 2 miles off by the sound of its engine alone. It was the kind of place where a stranger's car was itself a kind of event, remembered and discussed, precisely because it happened so rarely. Wayne Parker was, by the account of nearly everyone who worked beside him, a quiet, capable man who did not waste words, and Carol was known around 3 counties for a garden that fed half the families on the road some summers, and a kindness that neighbors still describe, all these decades later, without any of them needing to be asked twice. On the afternoon of July 14, 1971, Carol was inside canning tomatoes with the windows open, and Diane was reading on the porch step, and Ethan was playing near the edge of the cornfield that ran along the east side of the property, close enough that Carol could hear him. At some point, she stopped being able to hear him. She would spend the rest of her life turning over the exact minute that happened and never landing on an answer she trusted. She called his name from the doorway. Nothing came back. She walked the porch, then the yard, then the first few rows of corn, and the quiet in that field, she said decades later, was the worst sound she ever heard. Wayne came in from the far pasture within the hour, and the search that followed was, for 1971, about as fast and thorough as rural Idaho could produce. Neighbors walked the cornfield in a line, shoulder to shoulder, calling his name into rows of corn taller than a grown man's head. The Lemhi County Sheriff's Office sent out 2 deputies before dark. One of them a 26-year-old named Russ Hollenbeck, who had been on the job less than a year. By midnight, there were 40 people combing that property with flashlights and lanterns, and by morning there were more than 100. Farmers who'd driven in from towns an hour away because word had traveled on the radio and on the phone lines the way word did back then. Fast and total. They searched the riverbank. They searched an irrigation ditch that ran along the property's north edge. A detail that would haunt Carol for years, because a 2-year-old and moving water is a combination that rarely ends the way a parent can bear. They found nothing. No shoe. No shred of clothing snagged on a fence wire. No sign at all that a child had ever walked into that field. Russ Hollenbeck was the deputy who stayed longest at the Parker house that first week, and he was the one who noticed what should have been an obvious detail and instead became the case's first quiet mystery. The dog. The Parker's dog, an aging shepherd mix Ethan adored, had not barked. Not once. Not that anyone in the house or the yard had heard. A 2-year-old does not walk a quarter-mile alone and vanish into moving water without a struggle, and a working ranch dog does not stay silent while a stranger enters a yard he guards every day of his life. Hollenbeck wrote it in his notebook that first night, underlined it, and could never make it fit any explanation that made sense to him. The investigation that followed was, in its own era, competent. Idaho State Police assisted within 48 hours, sending 2 investigators from Boise, who would eventually log more than 900 man-hours on the case in its first year alone. Bloodhounds were brought in from Boise and lost Ethan's scent at the edge of the cornfield in a way the handler called strange, as if the trail had simply stopped rather than faded, a phrase that made it into Hollenbeck's notes and stayed there. Divers searched 2 miles of the river using grappling equipment borrowed from a logging company 40 miles north, working the deepest bends first on the theory that a small body would settle where the current slowed. They found nothing. Not one scrap of the striped shirt Ethan had been wearing. Investigators pursued 2 competing theories that summer and into the fall, and internal case notes, reviewed decades later, show a department genuinely divided between them. The first held that Ethan had wandered into the river unattended and been carried downstream, a theory favored early on given the property's proximity to the water. The second, favored increasingly by the younger deputy Hollenbeck, held that a person had been involved. Based on the dog's silence and the total absence of any physical trace a drowning would typically leave behind, snagged clothing, a shoe caught in root growth, anything at all. A composite sketch of a stranger's car, glimpsed by one neighbor on the county road that afternoon. A dark sedan moving slower than the speed limit was circulated to gas stations and diners across 3 counties. Tips came in for months. A boy spotted at a rest stop in Montana. A family who'd moved suddenly from a nearby town. Each one run down by an already thin department, and each one, eventually, cleared. It led nowhere. By September, the active search had wound down to the size a small county's resources could sustain, and by the following spring, the file had the word most families come to dread attached to it. Cold? Carol Parker did not let it stay cold in her own house, not for one day of the 55 years that followed. She wrote to the Idaho State Police every July for the first decade, on the anniversary, asking what had changed. And the honest answer was almost always nothing. Wayne Parker died in 1998, having never learned what happened to his son. A fact Carol repeated to reporters decades later with a flatness that said more than tears would have. Diane, the daughter who had been 7 years old on the porch step that day, grew up carrying a version of guilt that belonged to no one. The guilt of the sibling who was there and could not have stopped it, and knew that anyway. She became, over the following 5 decades, the family's unofficial archivist, the one who kept the newspaper clippings and the case numbers and the name of every detective who had ever touched the file. Because someone in the family needed to, and Carol, by her 70s, said she no longer had the strength to hold all of it herself. By 1976, 5 years gone, the Parkers had stopped putting up the missing posters themselves, not because they had given up, but because Carol said seeing Ethan's face age only in her own imagination, never in a new photograph, had become its own particular kind of grief. By 1981, 10 years gone, Wayne had taken to driving the county road alone some evenings. Slow. For no reason he ever fully explained to Carol, though she said she understood it without needing him to. By 1991, 20 years gone, Diane was raising children of her own and found she could not let them play unsupervised in a yard. Any yard, no matter how safe it looked. A habit her own daughter would later say she inherited without ever being told why. Carol kept Ethan's baby tooth in a small tin in her jewelry box the entire time, through 2 house moves and 1 house fire that took almost everything else of value the family owned, an object she could never explain to herself why she'd kept, only that she had. Russ Hollenbeck stayed too. He rose through the ranks of the Lemhi County Sheriff's Office over the following 2 decades, made sheriff himself by 1994, and kept the Ethan Parker file in a drawer of his own desk rather than in general archives, a small act of stubbornness that would matter enormously 55 years later. Every new deputy who came through that office eventually heard the story of the dog that didn't bark. Hollenbeck retired in 2006, still without an answer. And he kept a copy of the file at his home afterward, he told a local reporter once, because somebody ought to still be looking even after the county stops paying somebody to. For most of 5 decades, that was where the story sat. A family that never stopped waiting. A retired sheriff who never stopped wondering. A file with photographs of a cornfield, a shepherd mix, and a 2-year-old boy in a striped shirt, going progressively more yellow with age in an evidence box in Salmon, Idaho. If you've stayed with us this far, you already know how rare it is for a case like this to end any way but one. Subscribe now, because what happened next to this family had never happened in Lemhi County before. The break, when it came, arrived through a route no one in 1971 could have imagined, and almost no one alive in the case still expected. In the winter of 2025, a 56-year-old man named David Whitfield, living in Spokane, Washington, took a mail-order DNA test as what he later called a joke gift from my daughter. The kind of ancestry kit millions of people receive at Christmas and forget about within a week. Whitfield had grown up believing he was the son of a woman named Ruth Whitfield, a widow who had raised him alone in a small town in eastern Oregon before eventually settling in Washington state. He had no memory of his life before roughly age 3. Ruth had always told him his early records were lost in a house fire, a story he'd never had reason to question. Because why would a child question the only story he'd ever been given? The test results came back 6 weeks later and flagged something the company's algorithm is built to flag automatically. A genetic match strong enough to indicate a close blood relative, in this case a woman in her 30s in Idaho, named Melissa Torres, who had taken the same test the year before out of simple curiosity about her own family tree. The system told her she had a first cousin she had never heard of. Melissa Torres happened to be Diane Parker's granddaughter. What happened over the next 4 months was not a police raid or a courtroom revelation. It was a series of quiet, careful messages between two strangers on a genealogy website, then a phone call, then a longer phone call, then the sharing of old photographs that made a woman in Idaho who had never met David Whitfield sit down at her kitchen table and say nothing for a long time. Diane Parker was the one who noticed it first. A scar on David Whitfield's left eyebrow, faint and old, visible in a photo he'd posted showing off a fishing trip. Ethan Parker had a scar in that same place from a fall off the porch steps at 18 months old, a detail that had made it into the original 1971 missing person report because a deputy had thought, even then, that it might matter someday. Idaho State Police reopened the case formally in April of 2026. At the family's request, and with the cooperation of the genealogy company, which does not release identifying information without a court order, but will confirm or run additional comparisons when a law enforcement request is properly filed. A fresh DNA sample was taken from David Whitfield and compared directly against a decades-old sample the Parker family had, almost accidentally, preserved. A baby tooth of Ethan's that Carol Parker had kept in a small tin in her jewelry box since before he vanished, the kind of object a grieving mother keeps without ever quite deciding to keep it as evidence. The lab comparison took 11 days. The result was unambiguous. David Whitfield was Ethan Parker. The investigation that followed moved fast, the way cases do once the central fact is no longer in doubt. Investigators turned to Ruth Whitfield, now 81 and living in an assisted care facility in Walla Walla, in declining health, but entirely lucid. Faced with the DNA match and the photographs, and a detective sitting across from her in a small visiting room, Ruth Whitfield did not deny it for long. What she described was not the stranger's car of the 1971 witness report, not a kidnapping planned in advance, but something the investigators found almost harder to categorize. In her account, she had been driving the county road that afternoon, a woman in her late 20s who had lost a baby of her own 8 months earlier and had told almost no one the extent of what that loss had done to her. She said she saw a toddler alone at the edge of a cornfield, no adult in sight, and something in her broke in a different direction than grief usually breaks. She said she told herself, in the space of a few minutes, that the boy had been abandoned, that she was doing a kindness, a story so foreign to the truth that even she seemed unable to fully explain it 55 years later. She drove him across 2 state lines within 18 hours. She gave him a new name within a week. She told him, when he was old enough to ask, that a fire had erased his past, and she built a life around that lie so completely that she said she had, after enough years, begun to believe pieces of it herself. The dog's silence, investigators now believe, has a simpler explanation than anyone in 1971 considered. Ruth Whitfield was not a stranger to that stretch of road. She had passed the Parker property before. The Shepherd mix, by more than one account gathered decades later from surviving neighbors, was known to be friendly with people it had seen pass by regularly and hostile only to true strangers. It hadn't stayed silent for an intruder. It had stayed silent for someone it already recognized. Ruth Whitfield was charged with kidnapping in April of 2026, a case complicated significantly by her age and health, and by a legal system asking difficult questions about how to weigh 55 years of consequence against a defendant who may not survive to see a trial's end. The Lemhi County Prosecutor's Office has said publicly that the case will proceed regardless. For the family, the criminal outcome, whatever it becomes, was never going to be the point. Carol Parker was 93 years old when she was told, by a detective sitting in her living room, that her son was alive. She has said in the only interview she has given since that she did not fully believe it until she saw him walk through her front door, and that the sound she made when she saw him, she was told afterward by Diane, was not a word at all. Just the kind of sound a person makes when 55 years of a held breath finally leaves the body. David Whitfield, who has said he intends to keep using the name he grew up with in daily life while legally reclaiming Ethan Parker as his birth name, has described the reunion as something closer to grief than joy in the first hour. A grief for the entire life he did not get to live in that valley, before it became, in his words, the best thing that has ever happened to me, both at once, which I did not know a person could feel. Diane Parker, 7 years old on a porch step in 1971 and 62 years old when her brother came home, has said the hardest part of the last 5 decades was not the not knowing. It was watching her mother hold the not knowing every single day, and being unable to take any of that weight from her. Russ Hollenbeck, 91 years old now and living in an assisted facility of his own in Salmon, was told the news by a former colleague who drove out specifically to tell him in person rather than by phone. He reportedly asked only one question before anything else. He asked whether the dog had ever barked. When he was told the answer, investigators now believe he is said to have sat quietly for a long moment, and then said that it was the only piece of that day that had ever made complete sense to him, even though it had taken 55 years to hear it. There is a photograph from July of 1971 that the Parker family has kept for the entire 55 years since. One that ran in the local paper during the original search, and has run again in every recent story about the case's resolution. It shows Ethan Parker at not quite 2 years old, sitting on the porch steps of the family home, mid-laugh, one hand reaching toward the family dog just out of frame. Carol Parker has said that for decades, she could not look at that photograph without also seeing the empty cornfield beside it. The two images fused together in her mind as a single unbearable thing. She has said that since April, she has finally been able to look at the photograph and see only the boy, laughing, safe, on the steps, exactly as he was before anyone in that valley ever imagined a single afternoon could take him away for the rest of a lifetime. What do you do with 55 years that cannot be returned? What do you say to a mother who waited 9 decades of her life for one door to open? And what does it mean that the answer, when it finally came, arrived not from a confession or a break in the case file, but from a stranger's idle curiosity about her own family tree, 150 miles and half a century away from a cornfield in Idaho? Some cases end with a body and a verdict. This one ended with a woman in her 90s, standing in her own living room, watching her son walk through the door exactly the way he'd walked out of it, 55 years and 1 lifetime later. If this story moved you, stay with us. There are more cases like this one, cases where the truth took decades to surface, and the people who never stopped waiting were right to hold on. Subscribe, and we'll bring you the next one.